what we're looking at is Louis Sert, his Spanish Pavilion. And Sert was a student of the avant-garde architect Le Corbusier, who we learned about last week. He was a proponent of high modernism, that machine aesthetic, as Le Corbusier was as well. And the Spanish Pavilion commissioned a number of leading artists, avant-garde artists and architects to appeal to the world for aid for the Spanish Republican government. And just note that this has nothing to do with the political party in the US, but this is a government that is based on the model of a republic, as the United States is as well. The Spanish Civil War has on one side the Spanish Republic that was supported by left-wing political groups, people like communists and socialists, liberal social democrats. This group was mainly secular, mainly urban. They were working to preserve the Spanish Republic. They were also aided by an organization called the International Brigade, where 40,000 volunteers, mainly communists from all around the world, came to the aid of Spain. On the other side, we see the right-wing nationalist forces led by General Franco. And spoiler alert, I'll just say right now, Franco eventually succeeded defeating the Spanish Republic, and he established a dictatorship that persisted into the early 1980s. Now, the Spanish Civil War wasn't just about Spaniards, because other countries intervened. There was a French and British arms embargo. Britain actually encouraged their citizens to avoid any anti-fascist resistance, any work against Franco. And the only government that helped these anti-fascist forces, helped the Republicans, was the USSR. They supplied weapons, and they tried to help preserve this republic in Spain. Other corporations were involved as well, but mainly to the aid of the right-wing nationalists led by Franco. So, for example, the U.S. oil company Texas Oil, they supplied gas on credit to Franco throughout the entirety of the Spanish Civil War. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany sent troops, aircraft, weapons to help Franco, and they used the Spanish Civil War as a testing ground for new weapons and aircraft. So this is the background for Picasso's Guernica, which was the showcase in the Spanish Pavilion here. You see in this kind of sleek glass and steel atrium here, you see Picasso's Guernica in situ. There was works by the surrealist filmmaker Luis Buñuel, sculptures by Alexander Calder included as well. And in January of '37, Picasso, as a Spaniard, was asked to contribute. And he was working on this painting in the spring of 1937, when he learns of a bombing that takes place in the Spanish town of Guernica on April 26, 1937. This is a month before the fair opened. And sadly, pictures of the aftermath of aerial bombing, they are all too familiar to us today, but this event was earth-shattering because it was the first aerial bombing of civilians in a war. And to make the event more traumatic, there were reports that machine gunners came in afterwards to shoot fleeing civilians. At first, it was unclear who was responsible. The Republican government was receiving aid from the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union had its own economic woes in the Great Depression. They were greatly just outnumbered in terms of weaponry. And then Germany was backing Franco. And so what is revealed is that it was neither Franco's right-wing forces nor the Republican government who bombed Guernica, but it was in fact Nazi Germany working for Franco who secretly bombed Guernica. And this also shows us that Germany was preparing again, remilitarizing and gearing up for World War II. So let's look at Picasso's painting that shows us this event. I think the main question here is, how is the Cubist style used to convey the destruction of war? That kind of geometric fracturing of Cubism really lends itself, I think, to the idea of buildings being destroyed, city infrastructure being destroyed, humans being destroyed too, loss of life. We see this scene of just anguish, confusion, chaos. It's hard to make sense of everything. There's a key detail that Picasso changed from this earlier study here to the final product down below. We see a soldier with a severed lance here. That toolbar keeps appearing. Originally, his one arm was raised up as in a defiant fist. And this fist, this kind of raised fist, is a symbol of resistance that was a communist gesture at this time. We associate the raised fist now with many different political movements and protest art, but here it shows an allegiance to communism. And Picasso was sympathetic to the communists. He was at one point a Communist Party member, but he decided that he didn't want to show any political allegiance in the final product. He took out that political gesture to leave no partisan advocacy. He wanted to speak to the general atrocities of war. In fact, in 1945, Picasso said, "Painting is not done to decorate apartments. It is an instrument of war for attack and defense against the enemy." And I think the enemy here is violence, senseless loss of life, and this kind of proxy war that was being waged in Spain. This painting has a fascinating afterlife because what happens is, of course, Nazis, fascists, they look at this and they say, well, I mean, this is difficult to read. How can anybody make sense of this? And they labeled it degenerate, as so much of the work of the Expressionists, the Cubists, the Surrealists were labeled degenerate. But it became an important symbol for fascist resistance worldwide, still used today. As I said, Franco ultimately triumphed in 1939, and Spain became a fascist state for many decades. Picasso said, "I will not show Guernica in Spain until Franco is gone and democracy is restored." Franco dies in 1981, and so the painting is brought back from MoMA, from New York to Madrid, and it still just stirred up so many feelings for Spaniards that it was shown in Madrid with armed guards behind bulletproof glass. And I want to show you some examples here of how Guernica has become an internationally recognizable symbol of the anti-war movement. It was used in demonstrations against the U.S. Vietnam War, the U.S. Gulf War, the U.S. Afghanistan and Iraq wars. A tapestry of Guernica hangs in the foyer of the United Nations headquarters, and it was covered when Colin Powell stood there to announce the U.S.'s intent to invade Iraq without UN backing in 2003. Here we see an example of images of Guernica used in demonstrations against Israeli occupation of Gaza. And we also see this example of a political cartoonist who has changed Guernica into Aleppo-Nica. Aleppo is a city in Syria that was completely destroyed in the ongoing Syrian civil war. And the Syrian civil war has also been a kind of proxy war, as the Spanish Civil War was as well, where outside governments have been involved. So, for example, Putin, here shown as the bull, he has been financing and weaponizing the Syrian dictator Assad that we see here. The U.S. was also involved in the Syrian civil war as well. So we see the horse taking the face of Obama with the stars and stripes as well. We see the stars, the circle of stars here from the European Union. And so creating kind of morphing Guernica to still comment on war and destruction today.